We begin with chapter 15. A brief summary of what happens in this chapter is Van Helsing and Seward discover Lucy's tomb is empty. They manage to rescue a child from the blue lady, which we know is Lucy. They decide not to destroy Lucy or mutilate the body without involving Arthur, who very reluctantly agrees with the plan. So this chapter brings together the main male characters, and it kind of establishes their common purpose. It also looks at notions of friendship and love and duty. Remember, Seward is Van Helsing's pupil, and also the other two become his pupils. But at this point, Van Helsing is cautious about trying to lead his pupil to an understanding of the situation, and he realizes that trying to convince Seward of the supernatural nature of events is going to be difficult, and it's going to be very difficult with the other two men. He realizes that his task is a big one, and I think Stoker has created this. He's done a very good job in building up to the text and showing us the bonds of friendship that these men share. And now the men are under obligation to one another. They need to trust one another. They need to assist one another in return. And they have been united by past adventures. They've shared dangers. They share their love of Lucy. So there is definitely a bond and a link between these men. The other thing is Van Helsing is obviously bound and linked to Seward, not only because he is Seward's mentor, but because once Seward saved his life, which you remember in chapter 9. And the four men are united. Ironically, they are brothers, not of the blood, because of course they're not biologically related, but since donating blood to Lucy, they have become, I suppose, in a way, blood brothers. So just a reminder, if you recall back to chapter 9, the moment when Seward saved Van Helsing's life is mentioned, and of course, because he was sucking blood and he was sucking poison, the bond was formed through the sucking of blood. And this is ironic because, of course, the link between Van Helsing and Dr. Seward is therefore an exact reverse of the link between the vampire and Dracula. Because Seward is inspired to remove the poison from the blood because he sees Van Helsing as such a good man and worth saving. So what he's done is provided a life-giving action. I think in juxtaposition to this, we've got Dracula, who spreads a fatal contamination. So as soon as he sucks blood, he changes these bodies, he changes these people, and they become vampires themselves. And it's an act without free will. They do not have a choice in the matter. And of course, Dracula's motives are purely evil, unlike Van Helsing. Okay. Of chapter 15 with Seward's diary, and his first line is, "For a while, sheer anger mastered me." He's even expressing within this diary, which again, remember, is personal, that he has been completely mastered by his emotions. This is in the complete opposite to the traditional Victorian gentleman, who is not supposed to show emotion and is obviously supposed to be in control of his emotions. So it just shows us how irate and angry Seward is. And it's his way of expressing it. He obviously can't express it to the people around him, so he uses the written medium in order to do this. And he's clearly outraged by Van Helsing's suggestion that Lucy is the blue lady and is in fact attacking these children. And Van Helsing says, "Look, I wish to be gentle in breaking this to you, For I know you have loved that so sweet lady, but even yet I do not expect you to believe. So again, a pertinent link between the previous chapter and this chapter, and the idea of believing the impossible. And again, the theme of the supernatural is certainly coming out here, and it's the focus of the idea of having faith. And just because we cannot explain it with science doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Okay, and he goes on to say, tonight I go to prove it. Dare you come with me? So he assures Seawood that he can prove that this blue lady is in fact Lucy, but he goes one step further. He dares him. And of course, this is something that is a time-old stereotype and honoured tradition. You dare someone, especially a man, and he's got to stand up for his manhood and say, no, I'm not scared, and he's got to follow through on the dare. So, of course, this is what happens, and off they trundle, and they go and visit the children. They find out what's going on, and eventually they land up in the graveyard in Hampstead, where Lucy is buried. And I think it's important again here just to give you a bit of background information in terms of graveyards. And many of Britain's graveyards, if they weren't established in the Victorian era, certainly demonstrate a Victorian influence. So, as we've stated earlier, the Victorians had this morbid fascination with death. There is certainly the aspects of the religious element, whereby they believed that people were going on to a better place, but they seem to have spent a lot of time focusing on the ritual of death. Again, you've got to remember things like funerals, etc., are not for the dead. Dead people are dead. They don't really care if you wear black, pink, orange, if you cry or not, if you have flowers or not. Funerals and mourning are for those left behind. And it's an opportunity for them to come to terms with emotions and feelings. So this is part of it, and part of the Victorian obsession was to make a big deal out of it. Again, psychologically, you would look at it's the grieving who are left behind who maybe are trying to minimize their guilt. But what happened is the Victorians tended more towards large mausoleums and big gravestones, and these were also, the larger ones and the bigger the gravestones, certainly were a display of economic status and social position. So ironically, the social divide, which in Christianity in death is removed, was clearly intended to continue after death in terms of within the graveyard. So economic status counted just as much as geography in terms of where you were buried. It wasn't that you were necessarily buried in the nearest cemetery. It was where could you afford to be buried as well. So again, we move on and we have Jonathan and Van Helsing visiting the tomb at night. Again, a Gothic trope. So, because of course the night is scary, dark, we can't see clearly, but also it's a time when Lucy is active. As we know, vampires are not active during the day, and it is when obviously Van Helsing knows they will find the coffin empty. Okay. Again, I think it's important just to remind us that traditionally, in the mythic world, there is the whole idea of the visiting of the underworld, Hades and the underworld, the idea of crossing the river Styx. And I think the visit to this tomb draws on some of these mythic traditions of visiting the underworld. Again, maybe it's drawing in the idea of the Victorian preoccupation with spiritualism. They were contacting the dead, and spiritualism and trying to make links with the dead was very, very popular during the Victorian era. And also, I think, as we all know, based on many, many movies, graveyards at night are fabulously atmospheric, and I think this is what Stoker is also relying on. They get to the grave. Lucy is obviously of wealth, so she's buried in a mausoleum. So her tomb's within inside a mausoleum. So in they go, and Seward is very surprised because the coffin's empty. Van Helsing clearly isn't, but he doesn't explain or can't explain what's happened to the body because he doesn't actually know yet. And Seward says, it was certainly a surprise to me and gave me considerable shock, but Van Helsing was unmoved. So the absence of Lucy's body is the first moment of challenge to Seward's scientific mind. Up until now, he has been clearly logical, he's been rational, there has been no element of faith required. And so when he goes, he expects dead body, put in coffin, buried, he expects to find her. Please remember, she's not buried underground. She's probably in a concrete tomb with a lid, which they've moved. So it's not necessarily digging in required here. But now he goes there, and this tomb is empty, and this challenges his scientific mind. He tries very hard to offer rational excuses. Perhaps it was a body snatcher. He tries to defend his logic. He tries to think things through, but blatantly he just I think we know he has to just give it up and believe that this is supernatural. So he offers loads of suggestions because it's his way of trying to work through the problem. He's got to come to the understanding himself. Van Helsing can tell him over and over again, but until he grasps the situation, it's not going to become real. So they're waiting. Van Helsing goes off to do a little bit of, and Seward is waiting in the graveyard. He's holding vigil, and he sees a white figure approaching. So he's standing outside the tomb, and he's actually unable to see the vampire clearly. And he describes Lucy as something like a white streak. So he just sees this movement. So again, the implication is she's moving very quickly, and the idea of white is within the traditional idea of a ghostly figure. And she disappears, and out of the darkness comes the professor holding in his arms a tiny child. So while Seward has been holding vigil and standing guard, he sees a white streak, and out of the shadows comes Van Helsing with a child, which they leave for the police to find. And I think it's important because the rescue of the child has got to be a little bit of a victory for Van Helsing, because he, as we know, is somebody who bases his existence on the idea of saving, of helping, of healing. And he hasn't managed to help or save or heal Lucy. He's been thwarted at every turn there. So his ability to rescue a small child, I think, for him is a small victory. I think for the reader, we are able to feel some sympathy for Lucy. Unlike the vampire woman in Castle Dracula, we have sympathy for her because the child has been rescued. So she hasn't devoured the child. Remember when Jonathan Harker describes the scene with the child and the three female vampires, he describes hearing how they devoured her, and it was very cruel and was very nasty. But Lucy doesn't. We don't see this. We just see her as a white streak. And I think Stoker here is trying to imply that there's still a chance for Lucy's soul to be saved. They come back during the day on the 27th of September to revisit Lucy's grave, and shock horror, Lucy is back in her tomb, and of course Seward is amazed. There lay Lucy, seemingly just as we'd seen her the night before her funeral. She was, if possible, more radiantly beautiful than ever. So the discovery that Lucy's corpse is back in the coffin is really now forcing Seward to consider various options here. Is the possibility of her being undead has now got to be considered. Again, notice that the implication is while she is out and about at night, she is obtaining blood, and the more she obtains, the younger and more beautiful she becomes physically. Seward, however, ever the scientist, is still skeptical. She may have been placed there last night. He cannot explain this. This for him is a problem, despite the fact that putrefaction hasn't set in. I mean, she was buried on the 21st of September, 21st of September. So it's been a number of days. Yet putrefaction, or the corpse is not beginning to decay. So there's no smell. Yes, there may have been an element of preparation and embalming, but it wouldn't have been as extensive as what we do today. So there's no smell, there's not decaying. But so again, that's got to go towards explaining the situation and trying to highlight the supernatural nature of the situation. Okay. Van Helsing goes on, and finally he says she was bitten by the vampire. Yay! Well, finally, Van Helsing it appears that he's going to reveal what has actually happened to Lucy, and perhaps Seward is going to start taking this on board. He's going to start thinking, it's right, okay. Yet he goes on to talk about the fact that she was in a trance. He explains because Lucy was in a trance when she was bitten by Count Dracula, her innocence, some of her innocence and her goodness has been preserved. If she'd just been, if it hadn't been, she would not have. If she had not been a trance, if she'd gone willingly, this would not be the case. And the fact that he says there is no malign here reiterates the idea that there's some of Lucy's goodness still exists. So he's maintaining that Lucy is so beautiful because she was such a lovely person. She was a sweet girl. And I think it's important that we realize Stoker needs us to understand that Lucy is not like the other vampire woman. We do need to feel a sense of sympathy for her. Van Helsing is now seeming to get through to Seward, who says, I was in fact beginning to shudder at the presence of this being. So Seward's feeling of love, because remember he absolutely adored and loved Lucy, are beginning to change into hatred for the thing she has become. So it's not hatred for Lucy, but of the thing that she has become. And this scientific, rational man who never wavers in terms of his thinking and rational thinking, starts pontificating philosophy. He goes on to say, is it possible that love is all subjective or all objective? This man is very, very scientific. Yet he goes posing questions. It's like he's just thinking whatever pops into his mind. He's saying it out loud. He's clearly bewildered and he's confused because he's now talking philosophy when it comes to love, which is very unscientific. The question obviously remains unanswered and is clearly something he doesn't expect to be answered. It's like he's almost been just muttering as thoughts go. So Van Helsing explains that he intends to destroy the vampire that Lucy has become, and of course he thinks that Arthur is the best man for the job. He is the one who needs to be doing this. So they leave the tomb, they lock everything up, but later Van Helsing returns to watch the grave and seal it with garlic and a crucifix, of course, because he wants to prevent Lucy from leaving. And he leaves Seward a note telling him to read Van Helsing's, Jonathan Harker's journey. Van Helsing is, of course, Seward's mentor, and Seward looks up to him, and Seward thinks very highly of him, so he will do as he's asked. Okay, he will read the journal. So he does, and the next morning, the 28th of September, he says, following a good night's sleep, he starts to look at things again, and he starts stating that perhaps a good night's sleep is always very refreshing. It helps to put everything in perspective. And he's starting to question Van Helsing's mental capacity and is starting to question if he is in fact unhinged. And he decides that he is going to have to watch him carefully. He says, surely there must be some rational explanation of all these mysterious things. We go back again to the idea of rationality. Please remember, Dr. Seward is a scientist. Yes, he is a psychiatrist, but he is at heart a scientist, and he needs a rational explanation. And his aversion to the belief in vampires is clearly not yet complete. And of course, now that he's had time to sleep and think on things, he's beginning to wonder if perhaps Van Helsing is behind Lucy's disappearing and reappearing corpse. He still believes there's got to be a rational explanation, and that is why he's going to certainly watch Van Helsing very carefully. And I think it's an opportunity here for us to look at the idea of spiritualism in Victorian society. So when we talk about spiritualism, this involves things like seances and mediums and the idea of communicating with the dead. And this was an extremely popular pastime in Victorian England. Of course, it didn't matter your social class or your financial situation. The idea of contacting the dead transcended these boundaries. However, those with money tended to pursue the idea more rigorously and vigorously, purely because they could financially. Obviously, spiritualism and the idea of mediums was very popular in medieval times. It was very, very based on a great deal of superstition, but it became popular again in the mid-19th century in America. And then again, its popularity, because remember, America was the new world, setting new trends, and it came here and became very popular here as well. However, many mediums were exposed as charlatans. I'm sure if you watch any programs, I think this is a little bit old now, but The Mentalist was one which showed how people just are very good at reading other human beings and reading cues, and therefore are able to pick up on what they want to hear and tell them what they want to hear. During Victorian England, the big believers in spiritualism were Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the guy who wrote Sherlock Holmes. The irony is Sherlock being a very rational, analytical character, yet Conan Doyle believed in spiritualism. I mean, he was a big proponent of the fairy photographs, which turned out to be a hoax, which is quite interesting. And do yourselves a favor, you can look into that. It was quite an interesting situation. Another person who believed in spiritualism was a big supporter was Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the poet. She wrote How Do I Love Thee? She's most famous for that. And interestingly, the big critics of it were Robert Browning, Elizabeth's husband. And so it's interesting that he was a big critic because he absolutely adored his wife. It's known to be a very, very loving relationship. And another one who was a big critic was an important or famous author at the time, George Eliot. But yeah, I think the idea of communicating with the dead and finding out what's really going on is certainly something that it has to be taken into consideration. They really would like to know what's happening, especially since it's the idea of transcending and moving from the world of the living to the world of the dead, and the fact that Lucy is now undead is all part of this spiritualism. On the 29th of September in the morning, Arthur Seward, Van Helsing and Quincy all meet. Van Helsing is going to ask for everyone's trust. He knows clearly that Seward is not yet convinced. Interestingly, Quincy, the guy from the New World, the American, clearly very forward-thinking, the great adventurer, he agrees at once without question. Arthur, on the other hand, has some reservations. He's amazed by this plan of Van Helsing's. who he explains to Arthur he's got to open the coffin. They've got to save Lucy's soul. And again, we are reminded of the idea that Lucy's soul is still savable. So he says, I would save you from all of this, my friend, but this night our feet must tread in thorny paths, or later and forever the feet you love must walk in paths of flame. Now, this is quite interesting because this metaphor is reminiscent of religious imagery of, I'm going to mispronounce this and I do apologize, Bhagavad Gita, which is a sacred text of the Hindu scripture. I will spell that Bhagavadgita. It has been suggested that when Stoker was exploring and researching and participating in theosophy, remember that is theology and philosophy combined, he came into contact with the religious imagery and the Hindu scripture. Similarly, it is also reminiscent of Christian ideas. Christ not only talks about sowing seeds, which is, he tells a parable about how Christians need to spread the word of God, sowing the seeds, and how some of the seeds will fall into thorny ground, thorny paths, and be choked and not take root. So there's that aspect. But we've also got the aspect that Christ wore a crown of thorns on the cross when he was dying and sacrificing himself to save humanity. And the idea that if they don't save Lucy now, she will be walking in hell for the rest of eternity. She will be her soul will be lost. And Arthur then says, well, you need to take care. You need to be very, very careful here. And Van Helsing says, but Lucy's dead. But what if she's not dead? Oh, well, so he's suggesting that she's not dead. And Arthur, of course, is terrified. He suddenly wonders, has she been buried alive? It's terrifying from this, combined with the fear brought on by Van Helsing suggesting that Lucy is in danger of eternal damnation, is just too much for him, and he starts getting very stressed. And Van Helsing has to calm him down and say, but the reason she's not dead was not that she's alive, but because she's undead. And he even says she might be undead, and he says the only way to deal with this, of course, is to cut off her head. Arthur scanned. Heavens and earth, no, cried Arthur in a storm of passion. Not for the wide world will I consent to any mutilation of her dead body. He's absolutely scandalized. How can this man want to destroy the body of his fiancée, the woman he loves? It is very, very stressful for him. He says, I have a duty to do in protecting her grave from outrage. So again, we get to see what a wonderful, dutiful man Arthur is. He is going to protect Lucy even after death. I think it's at this point where I just think back, and as soon as you read at the beginning of this section, this diary entry, that of course Van Helsing has got Seward and Quincy and Arthur all together, it's the reader gets so excited. Finally, we're going to get the whole story. They're going to understand how it all fits in. Van Helsing is going to tell everybody how things are working. Yeah, no, everyone is still left in confusion, because instead of a full and detailed explanation, he gives us just the bare minimum. I'm going to break into the tomb. I'm going to cut off her head. Okay. So Arthur, of course, is now becoming the main focus here, which is important because he is potentially the next victim. But of course he reacts with horror. He still doesn't understand why Van Helsing needs to break into the coffin and cut off or decapitate his bride. Van Helsing appeals to Arthur on a personal level. Firstly, he calls him my Lord Godalming. So he appeals to his rank and status as a gentleman because he needs Arthur to trust him. Okay? He needs to do this. He needs to be able to cut off the head and put a stake through the heart. So he gives this short speech saying, please, Arthur, please trust me. And it's short but effective. And of course, Arthur is affected by this. And in this, Van Helsing reveals their common bond. He has given the blood of his veins to Lucy. He is willing to die for her. And if her death, and if dying for her will save her. So I think Van Helsing, his proud assertion that he's also got a duty to Lucy, because there Arthur is saying, I've got to protect your grave, I can't let this happen. But Van Helsing said, but I've also got a duty to this woman. I've also got a duty to the innocent. We've got to stop the innocent from being attacked by the Bloofer lady. And this is what he wants to say, but it's eclipsed by the fact that he's also sacrificed. He also donated his blood. And again, there's a lot of religious links here. Christ shed his blood for mankind in order to save mankind from sin. So the fact that Arthur finds out that others have given Lucy their blood shakes him up. It shakes his confidence. But yet he still shakes hands with Van Helsing. Clearly, Arthur is not jealous or upset that everybody else gave Lucy blood, despite the intimacy of the action. I think perhaps he is more shocked that it happened rather than who it was, but the fact that she had to have maybe so much blood. He seems very, very grateful, but clearly he's overwhelmed by all of this. It's a terribly nightmarish situation. And he says at the end, he shakes hands. He took the old man's hand and said in a broken voice, oh, it is hard to think of it and I cannot understand, but at least I shall go with you and wait. So Arthur seems impressed by Van Helsing's sincerity. He doesn't understand, but he agrees to go along with the plan. That just demonstrates the great trust he has in Van Helsing. So I think the end of this chapter shows Arthur being the epitome of the English gentleman with a stiff upper lip. He's resilient in the face of adversity. He states that he doesn't understand what needs to be done, but he will do it. He seems to be willing to endure what's going on patiently. By this time, I would be jumping up and down, demanding to know what's going on. I'd want to know the answers. He doesn't. He is willing to go on trust. He is the poster boy for the English gentleman. Okay. The other men clearly love Lucy. All of them are clearly concerned about Van Helsing's plan. But what we need to remember is that Lucy chose Arthur. And I think that in the eyes of the others, this is important because they feel that, of course, because Lucy made the choice, that Arthur really has the final say over what happens to Lucy. So he's the one who gets to say, I think if he says no to all of this, they would have had a problem. I mean, I think the men here are certainly showing the cultural values of the time. And the fact that Arthur gets permission, not so much that he's the next of kin, because he's not really, but the fact that he's the last man in her life. So maybe it's the idea that exploring, women were still essentially owned and controlled by men. They were a bit like property at the time. So that's why it's a cultural thing. It's values of the time. the legal status of women in marriage certainly was reformed by the time this book was written, because in 1882 the Married Women's Property Act was passed, and this gave women rights to own property in marriage, which previously they weren't allowed to. Everything they had came under their husband's control. But the fact that women before this were seen to be surrendering themselves in marriage, disappearing into the man's identity in marriage, there's still that element. It's the idea that they kind of became Mrs., or in this case would have been Lady Godalming. Instead of remaining Lucy, she becomes Arthur's. Again, we can get upset by this as feminists, but this was a cultural situation. We can't change. This was the belief, and this is what was the situation. So I think Van Helsing's suggestion that Arthur be the one to destroy Lucy is obviously a hard one for Arthur, but it's also ironic. And in terms of his destruction of her would be a symbol of love. Which, of course, is certainly ironic, because murdering somebody is not really the way we profess undying love. I think there's also a sense that he is the only one who can save her soul, which would be the ultimate gift. But again, there is still that element of sexuality. And again, I think this could be exploring the links of, is Stoker trying to question the effects of repressing sexuality, of not dealing with feelings to do with sexuality, because the final salvation will require penetration. To finish this relationship, penetration is going to be required. And of course, as soon as you say that, people do and immediately link to sex, but it's going to be the decapitation. They're going to have to cut off her head. And if those of you recall Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet, they talk about cutting off the heads of the maidens and cutting off their maiden heads, so again, it's a pun in the idea of taking virginity. And of course, Lucy should, in theory, have been a virgin. So not only is it doing that, but it is also the penetration of the stake through the heart. And again, so quite a violent visual image here, but it's in this case that it would really be inappropriate for another man to usurp Arthur's position here. I think Stoker is using the fact that the men take a while to realize the dangers that they're going to have to confront. He does this to control and maintain suspense over the next few chapters. Because it's taking them a while, again, we've got to look at the fact that how would the original audience of this novel felt if we have been so exposed to this Dracula myth. And remember, it's all been based on this particular novel, what we know about Dracula and Nosferatu and things like that. But for people first reading this, perhaps they also needed time, like the characters, to come to terms with what Stoker is suggesting. So what's he done? He's created a kind of a wealth of incidents to demonstrate how their misplaced discretion, remember discretion is very important, and their mistaken confidence in the extent of human knowledge, and their unwitting ignorance, because of course Van Helsing hasn't actually given them all the details, is going to leave them vulnerable. In this case, ignorance is not bliss, and knowledge is power. And I think it's these mistakes that they make is what will endanger that which they most wish to protect. So I think if we look at what is the underlying theme that unites all these episodes in this last chapter, well, it's certainly the idea of having faith and being able to look beyond the scientific. Because if these characters are to be successful, they are going to have to believe in something that challenges their very rational ideas and beliefs. So these are men who are steeped in rationality, or steeped in analytical thought, and they are being asked to abandon that and to believe in something they cannot see, and to believe in something seemingly insane. Okay. And I think Van Helsing's mystical appeal to the reality of the supernatural kind of increases. He gains urgency over the next chapters, and we're about to, in the novel, reach a major turning point, and I think this is why Stoker has done this. We need, as a reader, to be steeped in the supernatural because of what is about to happen, and we need to be open to what is about to happen. Again, I think as a 21st century audience, we are more inclined not to believe, but to be accepting of what Stoker has written, because we have been so exposed to the idea of vampires. It's popular in our culture in terms of, we've got things from everything from Buffy the Vampire Slayer to True Blood, and I think we've been fully exposed to the idea, so everyone has a basic knowledge of vampire lore, the idea of garlic and stakes through the heart. But Stoker is the one who came up with this and made all of this popular, so the Victorian audience reading it for the first time, this is their first exposure to it. We have got to remember that this to us isn't new, so therefore we are going to react slightly differently to the original audience. And again, this is why Stoker has set his novel out in the way he has, because of course his traditional readership, original readership, has also got to come to terms with all of this, much like his characters.